When Henry II moved to bring the lords operating across the Irish Sea under his control, Ireland entered a new political world. From that point on, its history became closely tied to the fortunes of the Plantagenet kings and the wider lands they ruled. During his stay in Ireland in the early 1170s, Henry claimed the important coastal towns and their surrounding territories for himself, distributed lands and privileges to loyal followers, accepted the submission of many major Irish rulers, and secured recognition from leading churchmen. Yet the bond between Ireland and the English crown was never fixed or simple. It changed over time because English power in Ireland itself changed. At some moments, that power expanded confidently, and at others it weakened and pulled back. But the story was shaped by more than events inside Ireland. It was also influenced by the changing nature of the Plantagenet realm as a whole, by the pressures of war, by the loss or defence of territories overseas, and by the shifting ways in which kings understood and exercised their authority. The Plantagenet kings did not think in narrow national terms. Their outlook was dynastic, wide, and practical. Ireland was only one part of a much larger world of interests, and its needs were usually secondary to whatever demanded the king's attention most urgently. In one age, that meant defending or trying to recover lands in France. In another, it meant wars in Wales and Scotland, or the defence of Gascony. Later, the long struggles with Scotland and France consumed enormous amounts of royal energy and resources. Because of that, Ireland was rarely the central concern of the crown. To later observers, this could look like neglect or even exploitation. It is easy to imagine alternative paths, whether an Ireland untouched by Norman intervention, or an island brought fully under royal control by a ruler willing to commit far greater attention and force. But judging the period only through disappointment can be misleading. It turns a complex historical relationship into a simple story of blame. Like other medieval realms, Ireland was shaped not only by the intentions of kings and governments, but by local powers, competing interests, unstable alliances, and the limits of central control. For a long time, people explained English rule in Ireland through grand claims of legitimacy. One of the most famous was the belief that papal approval had given Henry the right to intervene in Ireland in order to reform the church and society. Medieval writers repeated this idea so often that it became deeply rooted in political thinking. Yet the real foundations of Plantagenet authority were less dramatic and more gradual. The papacy supported Henry's presence and reforming role, but it did not immediately hand him complete and exclusive secular power over the island. Even into the 13th century, popes continued to recognise important Irish rulers as kings in their own right. What gave the English crown a firmer position was a later development, when King John placed both England and Ireland under papal lordship and received them back as papal fiefs. From that point onward, papal support for English claims in Ireland rested on a much more secure basis. This mattered greatly because it helped place Ireland more clearly within an international order, where the kings of England held it with papal approval, even if realities on the ground remained uneven and contested. As English rule in Ireland became more structured, the Crown also tried to extend into Ireland the same rights it claimed over the Church in England. Kings expected to control the revenues of vacant bishoprics, influence episcopal elections, and receive the loyalty of new bishops before they took office. In practice, this authority was strongest where English rule itself was strongest. But across much of the island, especially in the later 13th century, it was real enough. At times, cathedral communities even welcomed royal intervention when it helped their own preferred candidates. Still, the Church in Ireland did not speak with one voice. Some clerics supported English rule, others resisted it, and during moments of crisis the divisions became obvious. During the Bruce invasion, for example, parts of the clergy were willing to support a challenge to the Plantagenet monarchy. Over time, as the area directly controlled by the Dublin government contracted, royal influence over the church also receded, especially in the north. Yet, within the remaining core of the colony, churchmen continued to be essential supporters of English authority. The relationship between Ireland and the wider Plantagenet world also became clearer only slowly. In the 12th century, the Plantagenet dominions were a scattered collection of lands held through inheritance, marriage, conquest, and family arrangement. Ireland was added to this loose political world, but at first its place within it was not fully defined. The turning point came when John, who had originally been given Ireland as a separate possession, unexpectedly became king in 1199. That change tied Ireland much more directly to the English crown because it was no longer governed through the household of a royal junior branch, but through the king's own administration. At almost the same time, the loss of Normandy and other continental territories changed the whole balance of the dynasty. The English crown became more firmly centred in England, and Ireland was drawn more closely into that England-based political structure. Royal government in Ireland became more direct, more administrative, and more deeply connected to the machinery of the crown. This shift had major consequences. English law, already spreading into Ireland through settlers and officials, was increasingly presented as the law of the land. The idea that Ireland should be governed according to the same legal principles as England became a central assumption of royal rule. This did not mean that the entire island suddenly came under one uniform system. Far from it. But it did mean that, in the parts of Ireland where royal authority had reached, institutions modelled on England became more established. Government offices expanded. Legal procedures took firmer root. Administrative personnel increased. The lordship of Ireland came to be seen less as a loosely attached frontier and more as a possession of the English crown. By the middle of the 13th century, contemporaries could describe it in exactly those terms. Even when the king granted Ireland, or parts of it, to members of the royal family, the principle remained that it belonged ultimately to the crown and should never be permanently separated from it. At its heart, medieval lordship was always extractive. Kings, magnates, and regional rulers expected land to provide revenue, loyalty, military service, and prestige. In Gaelic Ireland, rulers expanded through warfare, exacted tribute, and competed constantly for dominance. Anglo-Norman lords also treated their Irish lands as sources of profit, carefully managed through agents and administrators. The English kings did the same. For them, Ireland could provide income, though usually on a modest scale compared with the larger financial demands of war elsewhere. At its most profitable, the lordship sent useful sums into royal hands, especially when kings squeezed it for campaigns in Wales, Scotland, or France. But revenue was never the whole story. The same systems that extracted money also helped build institutions. Administrative growth encouraged legal change, the spread of representative practices, and more regular forms of government. At the same time, incoming landholders promoted agricultural expansion, founded towns, supported trade, and reshaped parts of the landscape, especially in the east and south. Yet these gains came with limits, and those limits became more obvious over time. As the later Middle Ages brought economic pressure and political instability, profit from Ireland became harder to secure. Warfare, tribute-taking, and regional conflict returned to areas where more settled forms of rule had once seemed to be taking hold. English governments began to recognise that the lordship was no longer the asset it had once appeared to be. At times, they admitted that resources raised in Ireland needed to stay there for its own defence. Later, when revenue declined badly, the flow of money even reversed, with the English government having to subsidise administration and military efforts in Ireland, rather than drawing profit from them. Even so, the dream of turning Ireland once more into a valuable possession never disappeared. Kings and their advisers continued to imagine that, with proper reform, military force, and disciplined government, the lordship could again become a secure and profitable part of the wider crown. As the English crown expanded its authority across different lands, a new political centre began to take shape. The English Parliament slowly turned into a place where voices from across the king's dominions could be heard. Petitions arrived not just from England, but from Ireland, Wales, and even distant territories in France. At the same time, the royal treasury in Westminster kept a close watch over finances, examining accounts sent from places like Dublin. These developments were not limited to the British Isles alone. They reflected a wider political world, one in which the king ruled a network of lands connected by administration, law, and loyalty. Contemporary writers sometimes described this vast realm in grand terms. One chronicle, looking back at Edward I, portrayed him as ruler over England, Scotland, Wales, Gascony, and Ireland. While not entirely accurate, this image captures something important. By the 14th century, royal officials often moved across these regions, serving in different centres of power throughout their careers. A man might work in Westminster, then appear in Dublin, later serve in Wales, and even travel to Bordeaux. The system was interconnected, and those who served the crown were part of a much wider political world. Yet despite this broad horizon, the reality remained clear. The kings who ruled this network spent most of their time in England, especially in the south. Their ambitions stretched across seas, but their base of power was firmly rooted at home. Over time, a stronger sense of English identity began to shape politics. Kings like Edward III and Henry V were able to convince their subjects that wars in France were not distant adventures, but necessary struggles for the security of the realm. This was made easier by constant threats, including alliances between France and Scotland, and attacks on English ports and shipping. Ireland occupied a unique position within this system. Unlike other territories, it shared the same legal framework as England. While Wales followed a mixture of customs and Gascony retained its own traditions, Ireland was increasingly governed according to English law. This had deep consequences. It created a divide between the incoming settlers and the native Irish rulers, not only in terms of land and power, but also in culture and legal identity. Efforts were made to extend English law more widely across the island, but these attempts rarely succeeded on a broad scale. Instead, English legal status became something that could be granted selectively, often as a reward for cooperation. This selective system rarely brought long-term stability. Irish rulers moved in and out of alliances with the crown, and traditional systems of succession did not always align with English legal expectations. Some families came close to adapting, using English legal methods and working within royal administration, but these cases were rare. Even ambitious royal efforts to reshape relations with Irish leaders struggled to leave a lasting impact. The gap between legal systems remained a defining feature of the island's political life. At the same time, the spread of English institutions shaped how political arguments were made. Settler communities began to think in terms of rights, liberties, and legal protections. Their connection to the crown was not only based on loyalty, but also on shared expectations about law and governance. When conflicts arose, they often expressed their grievances using the language of English legal tradition. In moments of crisis, they could challenge royal officials while still declaring their loyalty to the king. This created a political culture that was both assertive and deeply tied to the crown. One striking example came during a major political crisis in the mid-14th century. Representatives of the settler community protested against decisions made by royal officials. arguing that these actions violated established law. They carefully avoided blaming the king directly, instead placing responsibility on his ministers. This allowed the king to respond by correcting his officials while maintaining authority. Far from breaking the system, such tensions often reinforced it, showing how deeply rooted these political habits had become. Later disputes over taxation revealed a similar level of awareness. Representatives understood that they were expected to support the crown in times of emergency. But they also argued that their own resources were limited, and that promises of support from England had not been fulfilled. Rather than rejecting royal demands outright, they used careful reasoning to defend their position. At one point, when asked to send representatives to England with full authority to make decisions, local communities refused to grant such power. They insisted on protecting what they saw as their own liberties, showing a clear understanding of political rights. By the early 15th century, political thinking in Ireland had reached a new level of sophistication. Ideas about governance, rights, and parliamentary procedure were circulating widely. Leaders were not only reacting to events, but also drawing on established concepts to justify their actions. This was not a passive or isolated society. It was one actively engaged in political debate, using the same intellectual tools that shaped politics in England. Yet power in Ireland did not rest solely on administration. It depended just as much on personal relationships and loyalties. Magnates, town leaders, and church figures maintained direct contact with the king and his court. Dublin was an important centre, but it was not the only one. Many decisions, especially those involving land and privilege, were made in England under the authority of the king himself. This encouraged leading figures in Ireland to look outward, seeking royal favour and influence at court. Feudal customs reinforced this connection. When major landholders inherited property, they were expected to perform acts of loyalty directly to the king. Some travelled to England to do so in person. These ceremonies were not just formalities. They were part of a system that tied Irish elites into the wider aristocratic world of the Plantagenet realm. Young members of powerful families often spent time in the royal household, forming connections that would shape their future careers. Towns played a crucial role as well. From the early days of English involvement in Ireland, royal charters granted privileges to urban communities. These rights were highly valued and fiercely defended. Among the most important was the ability to trade freely across the king's territories. This connected Irish ports to a vast commercial network, linking them to England, Wales, France, and beyond. Trade routes shifted over time, especially as wars disrupted access to certain regions. But the overall system remained extensive. Urban communities were not passive beneficiaries of royal favour. They actively engaged with the crown, sometimes working together, sometimes competing with one another. In certain moments, towns united to defend their shared interests. In others, rivalry drove them apart, leading to disputes over trade and privileges. These conflicts often reached the King's Council in England, showing once again how closely Ireland was tied to the wider political system. Among the nobility, competition was constant and often intense. In earlier periods, this competition focused on expanding into new territories. Later, as the frontier stabilised, struggles shifted to control of established lands and influence within the English-controlled regions. Powerful families competed not only on the battlefield, but also at court, seeking royal recognition and support. Success was measured not just by local dominance, but by favour in the eyes of the king. This competition created opportunities for royal intervention. Kings could use rivalries to their advantage, supporting one faction against another when it suited their interests. Sometimes this was a deliberate strategy, and at other times it simply reflected the shifting dynamics of power. In periods of instability, conflicts within England itself could spill over into Ireland, further complicating the political landscape. The composition of the aristocracy also changed over time. Some families held lands both in Ireland and elsewhere, linking the island to a broader network of power. In earlier generations, connections to Normandy and other continental regions were important. Later, ties to England became more dominant. New families entered the scene, while others faded. Despite these changes, Ireland remained connected to the wider political world through a relatively small number of powerful interests. Among these, some families rose to extraordinary prominence. Through marriage and inheritance, they built vast networks of land and influence that stretched across multiple regions. Others, though less powerful, still played important roles, especially in the areas around Dublin where English control remained strongest. Together, these connections ensured that Ireland was never isolated. Even as its internal situation shifted, it remained deeply embedded in the political struggles of the wider Plantagenet world. Ireland was never an isolated island. In fact, its position in the Irish Sea made it a natural crossroads of movement, trade, and conflict. From the late 12th century onward, these connections became even more important as Ireland was drawn into the wider world of the Plantagenet kings. War, in particular, played a powerful role in strengthening these links. For the elites of the lordship, military service was more than duty, it was an opportunity. Through campaigns fought far beyond Ireland, they could restore lost favour, gain rewards, and secure their place within the king's wider political world. By the time of Edward I, however, there were limits to what was expected. Landholders in Ireland were not normally required to serve overseas, simply because of their Irish estates. Even so, many still chose to do so, often for personal gain. Some demanded high wages, knowing their service was valuable. Others used military campaigns as a way to rebuild damaged reputations. Service abroad became a pathway to royal favour. Those who crossed the sea could expect more than just pay. They might receive new privileges, lands, or trading rights once they returned. For ambitious nobles, war was a calculated investment. Earlier generations had taken part in campaigns across France with greater frequency. Kings like Henry III relied on Irish support during their attempts to defend or recover territories overseas. Ireland contributed money, ships, and manpower. It was not a distant outpost, but an active participant in the wider concerns of the Crown. But by the time the 100 Years' War began, this role had changed. The lordship itself had weakened, and its resources were no longer as easily available. Instead of sending large forces abroad, Ireland became more focused on its own survival. Even so, individuals continued to take part in foreign campaigns. Their motivations were often personal. Some had fallen out of favour and sought redemption through service. Others hoped to gain wealth or influence. A knight from Ireland might fight in France, capture a high-ranking enemy, and return home with both ransom money and royal rewards. These stories show how deeply connected Ireland remained to the wider world, even when its direct contributions became smaller. At the same time, the relationship between Ireland and England was shaped by the rhythm of war. When conflict in France slowed, attention often turned back to Ireland. Major expeditions were launched during these quieter periods when resources were available. But when war intensified on the continent, Ireland was pushed into the background. Funding dried up, and local officials were left to manage with what little they had. This imbalance often created tension, especially when royal representatives in Ireland were expected to maintain order without adequate support. The effects of war were felt not only by nobles and soldiers, but also by ordinary people, especially those living in coastal towns. Merchants and sailors in ports like Waterford and Cork were directly exposed to the dangers of conflict. Enemy ships, piracy, and disrupted trade routes made life increasingly difficult. These communities depended on the sea, but the sea had become a battlefield. Their complaints to the Crown reveal a strong sense of loyalty, but also a growing awareness of their vulnerability. Ireland's position also reshaped relations with neighbouring regions, especially Wales. Before the English conquest, the western coasts of Britain had been zones of uncertainty, open to attack. But as English power expanded into Ireland, these areas became more secure. Military resources from Ireland could now be used to support campaigns in Wales, helping to tighten the Crown's control. Soldiers, supplies, and even food were sent across the sea, linking the two regions more closely than ever before. Yet this new balance also changed the position of Welsh rulers. In earlier times, leaders in North Wales had used Ireland as a refuge or a base for recovery. That option gradually disappeared. English control of the Irish coast closed off these possibilities, making it harder for Welsh resistance to survive. At moments, there were signs of shared hostility toward English expansion among Irish and Welsh leaders. But these connections never developed into a lasting alliance. The reality of English power, backed by resources from across its dominions, proved too strong. Relations with Scotland followed a similar pattern, but with even greater complexity. Before the late 12th century, the northern parts of Ireland and the western coasts of Scotland formed a connected world, linked by sea routes and shared culture. Over time, this world began to change. Norwegian influence faded. New powers emerged, including the Lords of the Isles. English strongholds in Ulster became isolated reminders of earlier expansion. For a time, Northern Ireland stood between two growing forces, the English Crown and the Scottish Kingdom. Both sought to extend their influence, often through powerful noble families. These nobles were not simply opponents of royal authority. In many cases, they worked alongside kings, shaping expansion through cooperation as much as conflict. This partnership helped build stronger political structures, even if it was not always intentional. The arrival of figures like John de Courcy in Ulster shows how these dynamics worked in practice. His campaigns were not just acts of bold conquest. They built on existing connections between regions such as Ireland, Cumbria, and the Isle of Man. His success depended not only on military skill, but also on the wider political environment created by the English Crown. Even when he fell from favour, he remained part of that world, returning to royal service later on. Over time, these early foundations created a lasting English presence in parts of Ulster. But this presence was never complete. It was strongest in coastal areas and river valleys, while other regions remained beyond effective control. The balance between expansion and resistance shaped the region's history for generations. Everything changed with the outbreak of the Anglo-Scottish Wars at the end of the 13th century. Ireland became deeply involved, sending supplies, money, and troops to support English campaigns. This placed heavy strain on the lordship, weakening its position at home. The Bruce invasion of Ireland was a direct result of these wider conflicts. It showed how vulnerable the English presence could be when faced with coordinated resistance. By the 15th century, the northern frontier of the lordship had become unstable and dangerous. Raids, alliances, and shifting power struggles defined the region. Yet the situation was never simple. Rivalries among Gaelic leaders prevented any single force from dominating completely. At the same time, some Irish rulers became stable partners for the Crown, allowing for negotiation as well as conflict. Beyond the British Isles, Ireland also remained connected to mainland Europe. In the early period of conquest, northern France had been a familiar world for many of the leaders involved. Even after the loss of Normandy, these links did not disappear immediately. Irish lords continued to serve in continental campaigns, and Ireland continued to provide financial and naval support. But as the 100 Years' War progressed, Ireland's role became more limited. Its resources were stretched, and its priorities shifted inward. While individuals still sought opportunity abroad, large-scale participation became rare. Instead, Ireland and France became, in a sense, alternative theatres for English attention. When one demanded focus, the other was often neglected. Despite all these changes, Ireland remained part of a larger political system. Its people, especially those within the English-controlled areas, saw themselves as connected to the Crown and its wider struggles. They shared in its dangers, its ambitions and its identity. Even as the lordship weakened, this sense of belonging endured. And yet, beneath this connection lay a deeper tension. Ireland was never fully integrated. It remained a land divided by culture, law, and power. The settlers who came from across the sea developed a distinct identity, one that set them apart from the native population. They saw themselves as part of the English world, even while living on its edge. By the late 13th century, especially during the reign of Edward I, Ireland had taken on a very clear and structured form. It was no longer just a land of shifting alliances and overlapping cultures. Instead, it had become a divided world, shaped by a sharp legal and political distinction between those considered English and those labelled Irish. This division was not simply cultural. It was written into the law, into landholding, and into power itself. One of the most striking aspects of this system was how differently the law treated human life. For those recognised as English, the law offered protection. Killing an Englishman was a serious crime, punished harshly under the law of felony. But for those classified as Irish, the situation was very different. Their lives were not protected in the same way. If an Englishman killed an Irishman, it was not treated as a grave criminal offence. At most, compensation might be paid, and even that would go to the English lord of the victim rather than to his family or community. This created a deeply unequal system, one that openly valued one group over another. Some voices at the time recognised the moral weight of this inequality. A leading churchman, born in Ireland but trained in the wider European world, openly condemned such practices. He warned that even if the law did not punish the killing of Irish people as a crime, it remained a sin in the eyes of God. His words reveal a tension between legal reality and moral conscience, a gap that would never fully close. But legal protection was only one part of the divide. Landholding formed another crucial boundary. Those considered Irish, even if they were wealthy or powerful, did not usually hold land under the same system as the English settlers. Their rights were not secured by the king's courts. Instead, their position depended on negotiation, on local arrangements, and often on the goodwill of stronger lords. This made their status unstable, always open to challenge or loss. From this flowed a third consequence. Political power remained firmly in English hands. Offices in government, whether at the centre or in local administration, were effectively closed to those classed as Irish. Authority, law, and administration formed a tightly controlled system, and entry into it was restricted. The result was a ruling class that defined itself not just by power, but by identity. Yet this identity was not as simple as it might seem. The category of English was not based on strict origin or blood. It was a legal and cultural label, and in some ways it was surprisingly flexible. People of mixed descent could be included, especially if their father belonged to the English world. Intermarriage, particularly in earlier generations, created families that crossed cultural boundaries. Over time, these families adopted English customs, names, and legal identities. Even more striking is how wide this category could stretch. Those counted as English might include people from Scotland, from continental Europe, or from regions like Wales. The key was not where they came from, but whether they were accepted into the legal and cultural framework that defined the ruling order. In this sense, English often meant simply not Irish. There were also cases where individuals of Irish origin were formally admitted into this system. The Crown could grant them the rights and privileges of English law, allowing them to overcome the barriers that limited their status. These grants were valuable. They opened doors to property rights, legal protection, and social advancement. But they were not given lightly, and they usually went to those who already lived close to the centres of English control. Even powerful Irish leaders sometimes sought this recognition. For them, it offered stability and legitimacy in a world where both were uncertain. In some cases, gaining these rights was seen as an achievement equal to victory in battle or success in politics. It was a sign that they had crossed an invisible but powerful boundary. Despite these possibilities, the overall system became more rigid over time. In earlier periods, the lines had been less clearly drawn. Irish individuals could sometimes appear in legal records, hold land in ways that resembled English practice, or interact more freely with the new order. But as the 13th century progressed, distinctions hardened. Legal categories became sharper, and the space for movement between them narrowed. This development can be understood by looking at the broader context of conquest. The arrival of English power in Ireland was not just a military event. It was also an intellectual and cultural project. From the beginning, the Irish were often portrayed by outsiders as backward, uncivilized, and in need of reform. These ideas had been circulating long before the conquest itself, shaped by church reform movements and political ambitions. When English rulers established their authority in Ireland, they carried these ideas with them. Their presence was not only about control, but also about transformation. They saw themselves as bringing order, law, and proper religious practice to a society they considered flawed. This belief gave their actions a sense of purpose, even as it justified exclusion and domination. Timing also played a crucial role. The conquest of Ireland took place at a moment when English law and administration were becoming more structured and clearly defined. This meant that the system brought into Ireland was already developed and less open to adaptation. Unlike in Wales, where local customs were studied, debated, and sometimes incorporated, Irish traditions were largely ignored or rejected. In Wales, there had been centuries of interaction between local rulers and the English crown. This created space for compromise. Welsh laws were examined, and some were accepted. Welsh leaders could hold office and participate in governance. Over time, a new elite emerged that blended native and incoming traditions. Ireland followed a different path. There was no long history of integration to build upon. Instead, the system introduced there was more rigid from the start. Irish laws were not studied or adapted. They were dismissed. The only way forward for those outside the system was to enter it on its own terms, abandoning their legal identity in the process. Another key factor was the role of the English crown itself. The expansion into Ireland was closely tied to royal authority. Many of the leading figures in the conquest were directly connected to the king's household, administration, or inner circle. They brought with them not just military power, but also the structures of English governance. This created a strong link between Ireland and the centre of power across the sea. Those within the colonial system maintained close ties with the royal court. They travelled, served in campaigns abroad, married into influential families, and built networks that stretched far beyond Ireland. Their identity was shaped by these connections. In contrast, native Irish rulers remained largely outside this world. They did not participate in court life. They rarely formed lasting ties with the centres of English power. Even when they attempted to engage, their efforts were limited and often unsuccessful. The absence of these personal connections created a deep divide, one that went beyond law and politics. Marriage patterns also reinforced this separation. In the English world, inheritance and power often passed through carefully arranged marriages, including through female lines. This created networks of alliance and continuity. In Ireland, inheritance followed different rules. Land and authority were not typically transferred through women in the same way. As a result, there was no shared system that could link the two elites together through marriage. Without a common framework for inheritance, and without a shared political centre, the chances for true integration remained limited. Even when individuals crossed boundaries, the system as a whole remained divided. At the same time, Irish society itself was changing. Long before the Conquest, powerful kings had been working to strengthen their control. They built alliances, supported religious reform, and developed more organised systems of rule. Coastal towns connected them to wider trade networks, and their courts reflected growing sophistication. But these developments were interrupted by the arrival of the English. Territories were taken, power structures were disrupted, and rival claimants were encouraged. In some regions, kingship itself became unstable, passing rapidly between competing branches of ruling families. Instead of becoming stronger, these systems fragmented. In the end, Ireland became a land shaped by contrasts. On one side stood a structured, legally defined colonial system, closely tied to the English crown. On the other stood a native society adapting to change, but unable to fully integrate into the new order. Between them lay a shifting frontier where conflict, negotiation, and cultural exchange took place every day. Ireland existed at the farthest edge of the Plantagenet world, beyond even Wales, and this distance shaped everything about how it was governed. Unlike the more stable core regions of England, authority in Ireland was never fully secure or complete. The English crown did not conquer the island in a single, decisive moment. Instead, control spread unevenly, driven largely by ambitious noble families, rather than by direct royal administration. These magnates carved out territories for themselves, often replacing native rulers. But their power was never absolute. In the more fertile lowlands of the east and south, English influence became relatively strong and structured, yet even there it remained fragile. Beyond these zones, especially in upland and wooded regions, authority constantly shifted. Gaelic rulers, English lords, and local warbands all competed for dominance, creating a landscape where power was negotiated rather than imposed. In this environment, the role of the aristocracy became central. These lords were not simply landowners, they were the true agents of power. They maintained order, raised armies, forged alliances, and managed relations with both the English crown and local populations. Lesser noble families fought continuously to defend their lands, often engaging in small-scale warfare year after year. But their efforts alone were never enough to create stability. What truly held the system together was the influence of the greater magnates. Their authority linked scattered territories into something resembling a political structure. And more importantly, they acted as the essential bridge between Ireland and the English king. Without them, royal authority would have been distant, ineffective, and largely symbolic. At first glance, this might seem like a typical medieval system, where kings relied on nobles to govern remote regions. But Ireland was different in one key way. Even its most settled areas were never far from unstable frontier zones. This meant that dependence on aristocratic power was far greater than in most other parts of the medieval world. For a long time, historians underestimated this reality. Many focused on administrative systems, legal institutions, or royal policies, often ignoring the deeper importance of noble networks. When they did consider the aristocracy, it was sometimes with suspicion, portraying these lords as disruptive figures who weakened central authority. However, more recent interpretations have shifted this view. It has become clear that these magnates were not simply obstacles to order, but rather the very foundation on which any form of governance in Ireland depended. Earlier, historians often judged these nobles harshly, accusing them of promoting disorder and resisting royal control. In their view, the crown failed because it allowed these powerful figures too much independence. Some even described the aristocracy as a barrier standing between the king and the people, preventing the development of effective government. This interpretation reflects a strong belief in centralised authority, where order is seen as something imposed from above. But medieval reality was far more complex. In practice, the king depended on these lords, even when they acted unpredictably, or clashed with one another. Their rivalries were not simply destructive, they were part of how power functioned. Conflicts between magnates created opportunities for the crown to intervene, reward loyalty, and maintain influence. Even at the height of royal power, disputes between nobles continued, showing that political tension was not a sign of failure, but a normal condition of medieval rule. The complexity of this system becomes even clearer when we look at individual noble families. Some of the most powerful, such as the de Burgh dynasty, built vast territories that stretched across large parts of Ireland. Their influence was not limited to English society. They formed alliances with Gaelic rulers, sometimes through marriage, and became deeply involved in local politics. These connections allowed them to operate in multiple cultural spheres at once. They could appear as loyal English nobles when at court, while also being accepted figures within Irish society. This dual identity was not unusual. In fact, it was a defining feature of aristocratic life in Ireland. Power depended on adaptability, on the ability to navigate between different traditions, languages, and expectations. Marriage played a crucial role in shaping these relationships. In the early stages of conquest, alliances with Gaelic families helped incoming lords secure their position in unfamiliar territories. Over time, however, connections with the wider English aristocracy became increasingly important. Families like the de Burghs, the Butlers, and the Geraldines strengthened their status by marrying into powerful English lineages and linking themselves to the royal court. These marriages were not just personal decisions. They were strategic moves that reinforced political networks and tied Ireland more closely to the broader Plantagenet world. Military service further strengthened these connections. Irish lords frequently joined royal campaigns in places like France and Scotland. Although their role in these wars was sometimes limited, their presence allowed them to maintain direct contact with the king. Service could bring rewards, restore lost favour, or open the door to new opportunities. For those who had fallen out of royal favour, participation in military campaigns offered a chance for redemption. Loyalty was not permanent. It could be rebuilt through action, especially on the battlefield. At the same time, the boundaries between different forms of power were often unclear. The distinction between a royal official and a great lord was not always obvious. Many individuals moved between these roles, serving the crown while also advancing their own interests. This overlap challenges simple categories like royal versus baronial authority, or resident versus absentee lordship. In reality, political life in Ireland was shaped by a complex web of personal relationships, shifting alliances, and shared ambitions. As time went on, these connections between Ireland and the wider Plantagenet world remained strong. Even when conditions within Ireland became more unstable and royal control weakened in certain areas, the importance of aristocratic networks did not disappear. Irish nobles continued to seek favour at court, arrange strategic marriages, and participate in royal politics. Their world was never isolated, it was constantly shaped by movement, both outward into frontier regions and inward toward the centre of power. England, during the later Middle Ages, stood out as one of the most organised and tightly controlled kingdoms in Europe, especially between the late 12th and 14th centuries. Royal authority was unusually strong, reaching far beyond the core of the realm. This strength did not stop at the shores of Britain. It extended across the Irish Sea, where English rule was gradually introduced and expanded over Ireland. From the reign of Henry II to that of Edward I, English law, administration and political systems were planted into Irish soil. Yet this expansion was never complete. Control did not cover the entire island, but neither was it limited to a small region around Dublin, as later periods might suggest. Large parts of eastern and southern Ireland came under English influence, especially along coastlines and river valleys, where settlers from Britain established new communities. These areas became the foundation of a new political and cultural order. English institutions took root there, supported by both military dominance and steady colonisation. Over time, these settler communities developed a strong sense of identity. By the mid-14th century, when expansion had slowed and pressures from outside increased, these elites began to emphasise their loyalty to the English crown more than ever. Their identity as English became deeply tied to that loyalty. To them, being English was not just about origin, it was about allegiance, law, and shared political values. Understanding this identity requires looking at the relationship between power and belonging. The spread of English rule in Ireland was not just a matter of conquest, it shaped how people saw themselves. The idea of being English in Ireland cannot be separated from the authority of the English state. In many ways, this situation resembles later colonial worlds, where settlers maintained strong connections to a distant homeland while building a distinct identity in new territories. Ireland, in this period, shows early signs of such a dynamic, even if it does not fully match modern ideas of nationalism. It was a lordship ruled by the English king, yet it developed its own version of English identity, one shaped by distance, conflict, and adaptation. For a long time, historians struggled to fully recognise this complexity. Traditional narratives often focused on later decline, describing how English control weakened and how settlers supposedly became more like the native Irish. This created a distorted picture, as if the entire earlier period was simply leading toward failure. In reality, the English presence in Ireland lasted for centuries and cannot be reduced to a story of inevitable collapse. Another problem has been the terminology used to describe these settlers. They have often been labelled as Norman or Anglo-Norman, avoiding the term English altogether. Yet by the late 12th and early 13th centuries, many of these groups had already begun to see themselves as English. This shift in identity was not immediate, but by around the early 13th century, it had largely taken hold. The spread of English law played a crucial role in shaping this identity. When King John visited Ireland in 1210, he made a decisive move by declaring that English law would apply there. This was more than a legal reform. It was a statement about belonging. Soon after, individual Irish people could be granted the rights of English law, though only through special permission. Over time, major legal documents such as Magna Carta were also introduced into Ireland, reinforcing the idea that the same legal system should operate on both sides of the Irish Sea. By the 13th century, it was clear that the intention was to create a legal unity between England and its Irish lordship. Political institutions followed a similar path. Parliaments began to meet in Ireland, attended by nobles, church leaders, and representatives from towns and counties. These assemblies passed laws, organised taxation, and addressed issues of defence and order. By the late 13th century, the structure of government in Ireland looked remarkably similar to that of England. Counties were established, officials were appointed, and systems of law enforcement were put in place. There was even a clear sense of territory, expressed in phrases that described the land as a unified political space under royal authority. Of course, the effectiveness of this system has always been debated. Some historians have argued that English rule in Ireland was only superficial, a thin layer covering a much more complex and fragmented reality. Power was often shared, contested, and negotiated. The Crown did not have full control, and local lords played a major role in shaping events. Yet despite these limitations, the English system proved surprisingly resilient. It was not an empty structure. It functioned, collected revenue, enforced laws, and involved large numbers of people at the local level. Sheriffs, judges, juries, and officials operated across wide Manatee, connecting local communities to central authority. Even in regions where powerful nobles held special privileges, they were still tied into the wider system. They had to answer to royal courts, account for certain revenues, and defend their rights against royal measure. Financially, Ireland also contributed significantly to the English crown. Taxes were collected, trade was regulated, and resources such as wool and food supplies were mobilised for wars, especially during campaigns in Scotland. At its peak, the Irish lordship generated revenues comparable to those of neighbouring kingdoms. All of this shows that Ireland was not isolated. It was deeply connected to England through administration, economy, and politics. Officials travelled between the two lands. Legal cases reached higher courts, and individuals sought influence by appealing directly to the king. These connections created a shared political world, one that stretched across the sea and tied Ireland closely to the English centre of power. Over time, however, this system began to weaken. Economic hardship, population decline, and renewed conflict along frontier regions reduced the reach of English authority. Areas that had once been stable became more uncertain, and the boundaries of control began to shrink. Yet even during this period of decline, the system did not collapse entirely. Government structures continued to function, local communities remained involved, and ties to England persisted. Even in the 15th century, Irish representatives gathered in assemblies, taxes were collected, and political life remained active. What emerges from this long story is not a simple tale of success or failure, but a complex process of interaction. English power shaped Ireland, but it was also reshaped by the conditions it encountered there. Identity, law, and authority all evolved together. The people who lived in this world were not simply English or Irish. They existed in a space where those categories were constantly being defined, challenged, and reinterpreted. In the 14th century, the English lordship in Ireland entered a phase that historians have traditionally described as a period of decline. Yet this label, while not entirely wrong, oversimplifies what was in reality a far more complex and gradual transformation. It is true that the structures of authority that had once supported expansion began to weaken, and that both political control and economic stability faced serious challenges. However, this was not a sudden collapse or a dramatic fall from power. Instead, it was a slow and uneven process in which the lordship became increasingly fragmented, regionalised, and dependent on local dynamics. Government did not disappear, nor did it entirely lose its effectiveness. Rather, it adapted, often in creative and improvised ways, to the changing conditions of the time. Officials continued to operate to collect revenues where possible and to maintain order, but they did so in an environment that was far less stable and far more unpredictable than before. The pessimistic tone found in many official records reflects not just reality, but also the frustration of administrators who were trying to manage a system that no longer functioned as smoothly as it once had. The question of when this decline began has been debated extensively, and different historians have offered different answers depending on what aspects they consider most important. Some see the mid-13th century as a high point, a moment when English power in Ireland was relatively strong and expansion had largely reached its limits. Others argue that the roots of decline can be traced back to this very period, particularly in the policies of English kings who treated Ireland as a resource to be exploited rather than a realm to be carefully governed. During the reigns of powerful monarchs, especially in the later 13th century, Ireland was repeatedly called upon to supply men, money, food, and materials for wars fought elsewhere, most notably in Scotland and France. These demands placed a heavy burden on the local population and economy, draining resources that might otherwise have supported stability and development within the lordship itself. Yet, it would be misleading to see royal exploitation as the sole cause of decline. Medieval government had its limits, and while royal policy could influence events, it could not fully control the broader economic and social forces at work. To fully understand the situation in Ireland, it is necessary to place it within the wider context of European history. The initial English expansion into Ireland had taken place during a period of remarkable growth across much of Europe. Populations were increasing, new settlements were being established, towns were expanding, and trade networks were becoming more active and interconnected. This broader expansion created the conditions that made conquest and colonization possible. However, by the late 13th century, this upward trend began to falter. Population growth slowed, the expansion of agriculture reached its limits, and the economic system became more fragile. Large-scale wars added further strain, disrupting trade and draining resources. Then, in the 14th century, a series of devastating crises struck, including famine and disease, which intensified the pressures on societies, already struggling to maintain stability. Ireland was deeply connected to this wider European world, and it experienced these changes in much the same way as other regions, though with its own local variations. One of the most visible consequences of these changes was a transformation in the landscape itself. During the earlier period of expansion, land had been cleared and cultivated at an increasing rate, supporting growing populations and generating revenue for both local lords and the crown. But as economic conditions worsened and populations declined, some of this land was abandoned. Agricultural activity contracted, and in many areas, farming shifted away from intensive crop production toward more extensive pastoral systems focused on livestock. This shift had significant implications for royal government. Taxation in the medieval world depended heavily on settled, productive communities engaged in arable farming. When these communities declined or dispersed, the ability of officials to collect revenue was severely weakened. In regions where English authority had once been strongest, the economic foundations of that authority began to erode, making effective governance increasingly difficult. What makes this period particularly interesting is that it cannot be understood simply as a story of failure or decay. While there was undoubtedly contraction and loss, there was also adaptation and resilience. The lordship of Ireland did not vanish, nor did it become entirely powerless. Instead, it evolved into a more complex and less centralised system in which local conditions played a greater role in shaping political and economic life. Authority became more dispersed, with regional powers gaining importance, and government officials were often forced to negotiate and cooperate with local elites, rather than impose direct control. In this sense, the so-called decline was also a process of transformation. in which the structures of the earlier expansion gave way to a different kind of political order. What we are looking at here is not a simple story of a government collapsing or losing control, but a far more complex and dynamic struggle to maintain influence in a fragmented and unpredictable world. In later medieval Ireland, power did not flow neatly from a strong centre outward. Instead, authority had to be constantly negotiated, reshaped, and adapted to local realities. The English administration based in Dublin operated in a landscape where power was divided among regional lords, fortified towns, church leaders, and powerful kin-based groups. None of these could be ignored, and none could be fully controlled. To survive, the government had to work with these forces, sometimes cooperating with them, sometimes restraining them, and often doing both at the same time. One of the most striking developments of this period is the growing importance of extended family groups, often called lineages. These were not just simple family units, but large interconnected networks that could control land, gather armed followers, and act as independent political forces. Some of these lineages came from earlier English settlers, but over generations they adapted to Irish conditions, developing stronger kinship ties and more flexible leadership structures. Others were entirely Gaelic in origin, rooted in older traditions of power and inheritance. In both cases, they became essential players in the political landscape. They could organise raids, defend territories, and shift alliances quickly, making them both dangerous and necessary. The Dublin government quickly realised that it could not simply suppress these groups. Instead, it tried to control them by working through their leaders. Laws were introduced that placed responsibility directly on the heads of lineages. If members of a kin group committed crimes, their leader was expected to deal with the situation, arrest the offenders, and hand them over to royal authorities. If he failed to do so, he himself could be punished or forced to compensate the victims. This approach reflects a deep understanding of how power worked locally. Authority within these groups was collective and personal, so the government treated it in the same way. Rather than chasing individuals across difficult terrain, it held entire groups accountable through their leaders. In practice, this system had mixed results. In some cases, it worked surprisingly well. Leaders who wanted to maintain their influence found it useful to cooperate with the crown, using royal backing to strengthen their own authority within the lineage. By punishing troublemakers among their followers, they could show both loyalty to the crown and control over their own people. In other cases, however, the system broke down. Leaders might refuse to act, or they might protect their kin instead of enforcing royal law. This reveals the limits of central authority, especially in regions where the crown's reach was weak. Negotiation became one of the most important tools of government. Officials frequently made agreements with local leaders, whether English or Irish, in order to maintain stability. These agreements could include promises of protection, financial payments, or military support. Even individuals who had been in open conflict with the crown could be brought back into the system through negotiation. This flexibility was essential. A rigid policy of punishment would have pushed many groups into permanent rebellion, while negotiation allowed for temporary peace and cooperation. It was a delicate balance, and it required constant adjustment. Another important method of control was the use of hostages. By taking members of powerful families and holding them in royal custody, the government created a system of pressure that encouraged cooperation. At the same time, pardons were widely used. Individuals who had committed serious offences could be forgiven, especially in frontier regions where conflict was common. This might seem like a sign of weakness, but it was often a practical decision. Refusing to pardon offenders could drive them further away from royal authority, while forgiveness could bring them back into the political system. In this way, justice became flexible, shaped by political needs, rather than strict legal rules. In the more distant regions, especially in the west, government began to look less like direct control and more like diplomacy. Officials often worked through local leaders, giving them authority to act on behalf of the crown. These figures might hold courts, collect revenues, and negotiate with neighbouring powers. In reality, this meant recognising existing power structures and trying to guide them rather than replace them. It was a form of indirect rule, built on cooperation rather than domination. In some cases, this approach helped extend royal influence into areas that would otherwise have been beyond reach. Relations with Gaelic leaders followed a similar pattern. The government attempted to recognise certain individuals as official leaders of their people, hoping to stabilise regions through them. These leaders could be rewarded with status, protection, or financial support in exchange for loyalty. This strategy resembles the way larger empires have often worked with local rulers, integrating them into a wider system without fully replacing their authority. However, success was limited. Gaelic leaders were deeply connected to their own traditions, language, and systems of power, and they were often unwilling to fully adopt the structures of English rule. As a result, cooperation was always fragile and temporary. At the same time, it is important to understand that the boundaries between English and Irish were not always clear. Many of the so-called English lineages had adopted Irish customs, language, and ways of life, while still maintaining a sense of identity tied to their origins. They might fight alongside Irish groups, use similar systems of leadership, and even share cultural practices, yet still see themselves as part of a different political world. This overlapping identity adds another layer of complexity, making it difficult to draw simple distinctions between groups. What emerges from all of this is a picture of a political system that was constantly evolving. The government in Dublin was not a fixed, centralised authority, imposing order on a passive population. Instead, it was part of a network of relationships, constantly adjusting to changing circumstances. Power was shared, contested, and negotiated at every level. Lords, towns, church leaders, and kin groups all played a role in shaping how authority worked. Rather than a clear story of decline, this period can be understood as a process of transformation. The structures of government did not disappear, but they adapted to new conditions. Authority became more flexible, more dependent on local cooperation, and more willing to compromise. This made the system less predictable, but also more resilient in some ways. It allowed the crown to maintain a presence even in areas where direct control was impossible. When we try to understand how government worked in medieval Ireland, one of the first things we need to remember is that the evidence changes dramatically as we move into the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Before that point, the surviving records are much thinner. Then, suddenly, the material becomes far richer. More official documents begin to survive, especially from the government centred in Dublin. Financial records, court material, chancery letters, and administrative documents start to appear in much greater numbers. This creates a major shift, not only in what we know, but in how the whole period looks to us. It can easily give the impression that government itself was suddenly becoming far stronger, more active, and more visible. In some ways, that was true, but it also means that the later period is seen through a much brighter light, while the earlier one remains half in shadow. That matters, because historians can be misled by the survival of records. A government that leaves behind more paperwork naturally looks more developed and more powerful than one that leaves behind less, even if the reality on the ground was more complicated. In Ireland, that is exactly the problem. From around the 1280s onward, the surviving record evidence increases sharply. By the time of the Bruce invasion in the second decade of the 14th century, we have a far larger body of material than before. Much of it comes from the circles of royal administration in Dublin. That means it reflects the routines, assumptions, priorities, and fears of the king's ministers. It gives us an extraordinarily valuable picture, but it is still a picture drawn from one side. It shows us how those officials wanted to govern, how they described their problems, how they justified their actions, and how they explained failure. It does not automatically tell us how power was actually experienced in every region of Ireland. This is one reason why the age of Edward I has often appeared so differently to different historians. For some, it seemed like the high point of English government in Ireland. The records show more counties, more sheriffs, more judicial activity, more financial structure, and a stronger sense of central supervision. In that reading, the late 13th century looks like a moment of administrative expansion, when the crown system reached further into the country than ever before. But the same records can also be read in another way. They reveal endless complaints about crime, disorder, official corruption, debt, local violence, and the difficulties of enforcing royal authority. The more documentation survives, the more the cracks begin to show. So the same period can look either like the peak of English rule or like the beginning of serious decline. That tension lies at the heart of the story. There is no doubt that English lordship in Ireland faced major difficulties during the 14th century. Economic pressures, warfare, demographic shocks, and the weakening of direct control all played a role. There were regions where settlement contracted, where once secure routes became dangerous, where revenue declined, and where the boundaries of crown authority became more uncertain. Yet it is too simple to imagine the English lordship as a centralised state simply falling apart. That image can be misleading. Medieval Ireland had never been a neatly unified political structure. Even at its strongest, it was a layered, uneven, and fragmented world. Power was shared, contested, negotiated, and often improvised. Royal rule varied enormously from one area to another. In some places it was direct and regular. In others, it depended on great lords, local communities, churchmen, or military intermediaries. In still others, it rested on temporary arrangements, personal alliances, and shifting balances of force. So instead of imagining a single strong structure breaking into pieces, it may be better to think of a dominion that had always been made up of many different parts, each requiring different methods of control. Some areas could be ruled through sheriffs, courts, and taxation. Others could be influenced only through negotiation, subsidies, hostages, or military pressure. The government in Dublin operated within this reality, whether it liked it or not. Its language often remained rigid and legalistic. Official documents spoke in simple opposites: peace and war, loyal and rebel, English and Irish. But the world beyond the parchment was never so tidy. Frontiers were unstable. Alliances shifted, local conditions mattered. In practice, government had to adapt. That adaptation becomes clearer when we look at geography. At the end of the 13th century, the governor of Ireland could still travel widely through the king's territories. Journeys connected Dublin and the eastern heartland with places like Carlow, Kilkenny, Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Roscommon, and Galway. These routes linked royal government with the great lordships and with important ecclesiastical centres. Such journeys reveal how crown authority worked in partnership with local power. The governor moved through a landscape where bishops, earls, knights, and royal officials overlapped and interacted. Hospitality, local knowledge, and lordly support all mattered. The state did not stand apart from these forces. It relied on them. By the 14th century, however, some of these routes were becoming harder to hold. Areas that had once been more securely integrated into the administrative network began to drift away from regular control. Travel through certain frontier districts became dangerous. In some regions, the crown still had claims, but its presence was no longer routine. Connaught is a good example. It never became entirely closed to royal authority, but it ceased to be part of the regular sweep of government. Intervention there became occasional rather than normal. The same was true in parts of North Munster and the Midlands. A determined governor could still enter such regions with enough force. But that was not the same as stable administration. The military obligations of the colony reveal the same pattern. In the late 13th century, royal military summonses still referred to campaigns in Ulster, Connaught, the Midlands, and West Munster. After the Bruce invasion and the further weakening of Crown power, those wider horizons shrink. By the later 14th century, the main focus of defence had narrowed toward the more established colonial core in Leinster and parts of Munster. In the 15th century, the defensive imagination contracted further still, centring increasingly on the 4 counties around Dublin and on the threats pressing toward them. This does not mean that all authority vanished beyond that zone, but it does show that the practical military world of government had become much smaller. The same process can be seen in revenue. The money actually collected by the Dublin government dropped sharply between the age of Edward I and the age of Edward III and Richard II. That decline reflected real problems. Yet even here, the picture needs care. Lower central revenue does not necessarily mean total economic collapse. It may also mean that the government found it harder to extract wealth from local societies, especially in disturbed regions. Some areas still contained considerable resources, but those resources no longer flowed easily to Dublin. Wealth could remain in local hands, be redirected into defence, or become inaccessible to royal officials. In that sense, reduced revenue shows the limits of collection as much as the disappearance of value. This brings us to one of the most important features of later medieval government in Ireland: local participation. Counties, liberties, towns, and local communities did not simply receive commands from above. They were drawn into the work of administration in many ways. Sheriffs had to be chosen. Assessors and collectors had to be appointed. Taxes had to be organised at local level. Peace had to be kept by people who actually knew the district. This kind of participation gives us a much more grounded picture of how government functioned. It was not just a matter of orders issued in Dublin. It depended on local elites, county communities, and men with influence in their own regions. The election of sheriffs in the middle of the 14th century shows this very clearly. In county after county, groups of local men were gathered to choose a sheriff and stand surety for him. The names that survive from these elections reveal a remarkable breadth of involvement. Some counties show something close to an English-style gentry community, with many families participating in local government. Other places reveal more concentrated patterns of power, where a few dominant lineages seem to overshadow the rest. And in frontier districts, the line between government service and marcher society could be very thin. Men who appear in records as sheriffs, peace commissioners, or local guarantors might also belong to families deeply involved in private warfare, raiding, local alliances, or cultural exchange with the Gaelic world. The official records do not erase that complexity. They only show one side of it. Taxation tells a similar story. Local military needs often led to local fiscal responses. Money was raised county by county, liberty by liberty, town by town, sometimes even according to smaller units like baronies, cantrids, or specific lordships. The system was far from uniform. In some areas, the barony remained the key unit. In others, older or more local structures were more relevant. The details differ from region to region, and that variation itself is important. It shows that government did not function through one simple model. It adapted its methods to local conditions. In some counties, the surviving lists of assessors and collectors are filled with familiar English settler names. In others, Gaelic or hybrid names begin to appear, suggesting that local administration had become more entangled with a mixed and changing society. This does not mean that the English system disappeared. In many places it remained real, even where it had become patchy. A county could be territorially incomplete and still matter enormously as a frame for taxation, defence, and local organisation. Some towns and districts survived as isolated strongpoints, linked more by administration and political habit than by secure territorial continuity. That is one of the defining features of the later lordship. Not disappearance, but fragmentation. The role of great lords also needs to be understood in this context. It is tempting to imagine them simply as rivals to central government, but that is too crude. Their liberties and franchises certainly reduced direct royal control in some respects. Government officials often complained about them. Yet these lordships were not just obstacles. In practice, they formed part of the political structure through which power had to operate. Some liberties were created in moments of political crisis to secure support from powerful men. Others reflected the realities of local dominance. These grants were not always part of some grand constitutional design. Often they were immediate political bargains. But once they existed, they became important components of regional power. Even more significant than formal liberties was a broader process of devolution. As central government became less able to rule directly in every place, it increasingly recognised and relied on existing local powers. Sometimes that meant entrusting authority to major nobles. At other times it meant empowering local communities, towns, bishops, or selected military figures. This was not devolution in the modern sense of carefully planned decentralisation. It was more often a practical recognition that influence already existed in local hands, and that government had to work through it if it wanted any results at all. This can be seen especially in the later 14th century, when relations between the Crown and the leading Earls of Ireland improved after earlier periods of tension. From that point onward, the Crown increasingly used great lords as governors, deputies, peacekeepers, and judicial authorities. Powerful earls received commissions extending across whole provinces. These commissions could include military command, powers of negotiation, judicial authority, and responsibility for suppressing disorder. Such arrangements were deeply political, and they were often tied to aristocratic rivalries. But they also reveal something more fundamental. The Crown was acknowledging that real power in the regions depended on those men. Government could not simply impose itself from Dublin. It had to attach itself to existing structures of authority. In Connaught and other more difficult regions, this process becomes even clearer. There, the government tried to sustain its influence by working through local intermediaries, whether English, Gaelic, or mixed in identity. It could appoint temporary governors, support certain dynastic factions, grant privileges to towns like Galway, or try to use local rivals against one another. These efforts were often unstable and sometimes failed. But they show a government still active, still adaptive, and still trying to shape events even where direct rule had weakened. The Church formed another crucial layer in this picture. Medieval Ireland lacked the clean political and ecclesiastical unity found in some other kingdoms. Even so, bishops, archbishops, priors, and abbots were deeply involved in public life. They attended parliaments and councils. They helped proclaim legislation. They acted as auditors, supervisors, negotiators, and peace commissioners. Some were deeply embedded in local society, while others were tied closely to the central administration. So in disturbed regions, higher clergy could also serve as intermediaries between the government and local powers. Their authority, local standing, and literacy made them useful instruments of rule. At times, they acted not only in defence of church interests, but also as practical agents, helping to preserve crown influence. The same is true of the towns. Larger ports and walled boroughs remained essential nodes of English power. They were economically important, but they were also administrative and military centres. As conditions worsened, the Crown increasingly allowed towns to retain certain revenues for their own defence, especially for walls, fortifications, and local security. Sometimes they were excused from certain wider burdens. Sometimes they were expected to manage their own peacekeeping or contribute directly to military campaigns. These measures may look like evidence of central weakness, and in one sense, they were. But they were also part of a survival strategy. By allowing towns greater room to defend themselves, the government helped preserve the very communities through which English authority in Ireland continued to function. One of the most revealing aspects of this changing world is the Crown's growing engagement with powerful lineages, both settler and Gaelic. Extended settler families had become major forces in many regions. Some were deeply Gaelicized in language, customs, or local alliances, yet still thought of themselves as English, and were treated differently from the Irish by the government. The Crown increasingly tried to make the heads of such lineages responsible for the actions of their followers. Laws and administrative practice expected them to discipline their own men, deliver offenders, or answer for local disorder. This was not always effective, but it shows an important shift. Government was trying to work through kinship-based power rather than simply condemning it. Similar patterns appeared in relations with Gaelic leaders. Here too, the government often relied on selected individuals, recognizing them as local chiefs, making temporary alliances with them, using them as military partners, or drawing them into negotiated arrangements. In military terms, some Gaelic lords could become very useful allies. At times they guarded marches, attacked enemies of the Crown, or mediated with other leaders. Yet the deeper barriers remained strong. English law, English assumptions, and English political culture made full integration difficult. Gaelic leaders could be used, recognised, rewarded, even knighted in rare cases. But their full absorption into the governing structure remained limited and unstable. When we look at the surviving records of medieval Ireland, especially the chancery rolls, what immediately stands out is just how detailed and wide-ranging they are. These documents are not limited to laws or official decisions. Instead, they open a window into almost every aspect of life connected to the English administration in Ireland. They reveal politics, landholding, church affairs, trade, and even the everyday movement of people between Ireland and England. Through them, we don't just see institutions, we see individuals moving through a connected world. Some of the most revealing moments come from what seem like small, routine entries. A royal messenger crossing the sea in the mid-14th century, later compensated for losing his horse during the journey. A servant of a powerful Irish lord travelling to deliver horses directly to the English king. A young man from a prominent legal family heading to England, possibly to study law. A clergyman leaving his parish to spend years at Oxford, improving his education. These are not dramatic events, but together they show something important. Ireland and England were closely linked, not just politically, but through constant movement of people, ideas, and opportunities. This connection was not always smooth or predictable. Travel depended heavily on weather and sea conditions. Winds and tides could delay journeys for days or even weeks. But when conditions were favourable, communication could actually be surprisingly fast. In some cases, it was easier to travel from southern Irish ports like Waterford or Youghal to Bristol, and then onto the English royal court, than it was to travel across northern England itself. This reminds us that medieval political systems were not as isolated or slow-moving as we often imagine. They were connected through networks that could function efficiently under the right circumstances. The records also reveal how closely the English crown monitored events in Ireland. News could travel quickly enough for decisions to be made in England and then enforced across the Irish Sea within a matter of weeks. When a major political figure died in Ireland, the English government responded almost immediately by appointing a successor, even if that successor was still a child. This was not a sign of chaos or confusion. It was a calculated move. By choosing someone with royal connections, the Crown was making a statement about its authority and its continued commitment to Ireland. At the same time, experienced figures were expected to handle real power behind the scenes. In other cases, the Crown issued detailed instructions about what should happen next. Orders could be sent to call assemblies, raise taxes, or organise political responses to ongoing conflicts. These instructions often made it clear that events in Ireland were not isolated. They were tied to wider royal concerns, especially wars being fought elsewhere, such as in France. Ireland was part of a broader political system, and its resources and decisions were connected to that larger picture. Another striking feature of these records is the overlap between different layers of authority. In church matters, for example, appointments were not simply local decisions. A new archbishop might be chosen by the Pope, but before he could take full control of his position, he had to gain approval from the English crown. This meant swearing loyalty to the king and agreeing not to challenge royal rights. Only after this process was complete could he fully assume his role. This reveals a complex chain of authority stretching from Rome to England and then into Ireland, with each level influencing the final outcome. The same sense of centralised authority appears in legal matters. At least in theory, the king's power in Ireland was no weaker than in England itself. Laws passed in England could be extended to Ireland with a single decision. This created a strong legal connection between the two regions, one that would have long-lasting consequences. The English legal system became one of the most enduring legacies of this period, shaping institutions that would survive for centuries. Yet despite this appearance of strong central control, the reality on the ground was far more complicated. The same records that show royal authority also reveal its limits. By the later 14th century, English rule in Ireland was under increasing pressure. Its reach was shrinking, both geographically and culturally. Some areas remained firmly under control, especially around Dublin and along the eastern coast. In these regions, English law and administration were deeply established. Government could operate in a structured and recognisable way. Beyond these core areas, however, authority became less direct. In many regions, the Crown relied on powerful local lords to maintain order and influence events. These areas were not fully controlled, but they were not completely independent either. Instead, they existed in a middle ground where power was negotiated, rather than imposed. This distinction helps us understand the difference between what might be called the core of English rule and the wider sphere of influence, where control was more flexible and uncertain. Even this distinction, though useful, can oversimplify the situation. The boundaries between strong control and weaker influence were never fixed. They shifted over time, depending on political conditions, local alliances, and military strength. Authority was not a single, uniform system. It was constantly changing, adapting to new challenges and opportunities. In the regions where English control was strongest, the machinery of government was highly active. Officials investigated crimes, enforced laws, collected taxes, and monitored land disputes. Commissions were regularly sent out to deal with everything from minor offences to serious acts of rebellion. Local elites played an important role in this system. They served as judges, administrators, and representatives of royal authority. This created a close relationship between central government and local society, especially in the areas closest to Dublin. Further away, the situation was different. In these regions, government relied more heavily on powerful nobles. Instead of broad participation by local communities, authority tended to be concentrated in the hands of a few dominant families. This reflects the realities of a frontier society, where control depended as much on personal power and influence as on formal institutions. One of the most interesting aspects of this system is how it adapted to local conditions. Instead of imposing a single model everywhere, the government allowed for variation. In some areas, local communities organised their own defences and raised their own taxes to deal with immediate threats. These local efforts were often more practical than waiting for support from the centre. They also show that political development did not always follow a single path toward centralisation. In Ireland, local solutions often made more sense than uniform control. The records also reveal how deeply local society was involved in governance. Taxes were not simply imposed from above. They were assessed and collected by people within each region. Local leaders were responsible for organising payments, raising troops, and maintaining order. This created a system that depended on cooperation as much as authority. Even when central government weakened, these local structures helped keep the system functioning. At the same time, powerful families played a crucial role. Some of these families had originally come from England, but had become deeply rooted in Irish society. Others were native Irish dynasties. Over time, the government began to rely on both. Leaders of these families were expected to control their followers, maintain peace, and support royal authority when required. In return, they received recognition, privileges, and sometimes financial rewards. This relationship was not always stable. Conflicts, rivalries, and shifting alliances were constant features of the political landscape. But rather than destroying the system, these dynamics became part of how it worked. Government adapted by working through these networks of power instead of trying to eliminate them. Even in regions far from direct control, the Crown continued to exert influence. It could appoint local leaders to official positions, grant privileges, or intervene in disputes. These actions might seem symbolic, but they were important. They maintained a sense of connection between distant regions and the central authority. In many cases, this kind of indirect influence was more realistic than attempting full control. Another key feature of this period is the interaction between different cultures. The records frequently mention Irish individuals, sometimes in hostile terms, but also in ways that show cooperation and integration. Legal distinctions existed between those considered English and those considered Irish. These distinctions affected access to courts, property rights, and legal protections. However, they were not absolute. Some Irish individuals could gain English legal status, especially if they had wealth or powerful connections. At the same time, relationships between English settlers and Irish families were often close. Intermarriage, shared customs, and cultural exchange were common, even if officially discouraged. Laws tried to limit these interactions, but the records show that such connections continued to exist in practice. This creates a complex picture where division and integration existed side by side. Military cooperation provides another example of this interaction. Irish leaders often worked with the English crown, providing troops or maintaining order in their regions. In return, they received payments and recognition. Over time, some were officially acknowledged as leaders of their people, with responsibilities similar to those of English lords. This created a system where formal authority and informal power worked together. All of this shows that medieval Ireland was not simply a place where English rule was either strong or weak. It was a dynamic and flexible system, shaped by geography, politics, and social relationships. Authority was not uniform. and it was never fully secure. But it was also not collapsing. Instead, it was constantly adapting, finding new ways to function in a complex and changing environment. For a long time, the study of medieval Ireland was shaped by a quiet division. Historians who worked on the world of the English lordship usually turned to royal records, legal rolls, parliamentary material, and administrative documents. Historians of Gaelic Ireland, by contrast, often relied on Irish language annals, genealogies, bardic poetry, and native traditions. The result was that the island's past often appeared split into two separate historical worlds. One was presented through the language of law, government, and institutions. The other came alive through kinship, lordship, memory, and cultural continuity. They were not false histories, but they were incomplete when kept apart. Medieval Ireland was never truly divided into two sealed worlds. The reality was always messier, more entangled, and more human than that. In many ways, this division was not created deliberately. It emerged from the habits and priorities of scholarship itself. Historians such as Henry Gerald Richardson and George Osborne Sayles were deeply interested in the machinery of rule. They studied chancery letters, parliamentary developments, legal structures, administrative offices, and the written frameworks through which the English crown tried to govern Ireland. Their attention naturally gravitated toward the most recognisably English or Anglo-French features of the lordship. That is where their training led them, and that is where they believed they could make the most solid and lasting contributions. At the same time, scholars interested in Gaelic Ireland often approached the period from a very different angle. They were drawn to Irish language sources, to the internal world of Gaelic lordships, to cultural survival, to dynastic politics, to poetry and memory. Over time, this produced a powerful scholarly separation. It was almost as though one group of historians studied the record of power, while another studied the memory of a people. Both were working on Ireland, but often they were not really working together. That gap between the histories of English Ireland and Gaelic Ireland became wider, almost by accident. Richardson and Sayles did not intend to deepen it, but the influence of their work was so strong that it reinforced certain habits of thought. Their books were pioneering, and because they were pioneering, later scholars often built on their foundations, rather than moving immediately beyond them. Their emphasis on institutions, government, and legal structures encouraged readers to see the history of the lordship, chiefly through official lenses. Their work was enormously valuable, but it inevitably placed the spotlight on the parts of Irish life that left the clearest trace in formal records. This meant that the political culture of the crown, the routines of administration, and the structures of parliament and law stood in the foreground, while many of the cultural and regional interactions that linked English and Gaelic worlds remained less visible. Yet the answer was never to reject their work. The answer was to widen the frame. One of the most fruitful ways of doing that has been through the study of regions, local lordships, family networks, and frontier societies. Once historians stopped treating medieval Ireland as a simple contest between two cleanly separated communities, a richer picture begins to emerge. In some areas, English law and institutions were strong, but Gaelic customs, names, alliances, and cultural habits survived within the same society. In other regions, Gaelic lordships interacted constantly with the crown, receiving fees, making submissions, giving hostages, entering truces, and participating in military arrangements, all without fully becoming part of the English political world. Elsewhere, towns, marcher families, churchmen, and local elites created societies that cannot be described adequately as either fully English or fully Gaelic. They were mixed, layered, unstable, and constantly changing. This regional approach is important because it restores movement to a history that can otherwise seem too rigid. The older habit of speaking about English Ireland and Gaelic Ireland as though they were two solid blocks obscures the countless channels through which people crossed legal, cultural, and political boundaries. Marriage, fostering, military service, trade, clerical careers, legal petitions, private alliances, and local negotiation all created points of contact. Some of these contacts were tense and suspicious. Others were practical and routine. Some were condemned by official legislation, yet continued anyway. The reality on the ground was rarely as neat as the categories used by governments or by later historians. Even so, it would be unfair to place too much blame on Richardson and Sales for not producing the broader, more integrated history that later scholars have wanted. They were working at a time when medieval Irish history, as a field, was still developing. Many sources were scattered, unpublished, difficult to access, or poorly understood. The archives had suffered enormous losses. The number of scholars trained to handle both administrative Latin and Irish language material was very small. Under those conditions, Richardson and Sales concentrated on what they could do best. They brought discipline, rigour, and professionalism to a field that badly needed them. They proved that medieval Irish history could be studied with the same seriousness and technical skill as medieval English history. They exposed weak assumptions, corrected inherited errors, and made a large body of neglected material usable for future research. That achievement should not be underestimated. Their work was pioneering precisely because it did not attempt everything at once. They opened one part of the field and opened it decisively. They showed how the institutions of lordship worked, how royal administration functioned, how Parliament developed, how legal structures operated, and how the English crown projected authority into Ireland. Those questions mattered, and they still matter. Without their efforts, much of the later and more nuanced scholarship would have lacked a firm foundation. It is easy for later generations working in a richer historiographical environment to point out what they did not do. But that criticism only has force because they first made so much possible. The deeper problem was not that Richardson and Sales were too narrow. The deeper problem was that for too long, too few historians moved beyond the ground they had prepared. Their research was so advanced, and the field around them was still so underdeveloped, that their priorities could seem to define the whole subject. The fault, if there was one, lay less in their work than in the slowness of others to broaden the conversation. Medieval Ireland did not suffer from a shortage of sources. It suffered from a shortage of scholars willing to master the very different kinds of evidence that its history required. That is why the separation between English Ireland and Gaelic Ireland lasted so long within scholarship. The materials for a more integrated history existed, but the intellectual labour needed to combine them came only gradually. What has become clearer over time is that the most revealing histories are often those that resist simple labels. When historians study a county, a frontier district, a bishopric, a lineage, a town, or a regional lordship in depth, they often find that the categories begin to blur. A family described in official records as English may appear in Irish poetry as part of a Gaelic political world. A churchman appointed through crown structures may negotiate with Gaelic lords in ways that reflect local custom more than royal theory. A town may present itself as a bastion of English loyalty, while depending economically and politically on accommodation with neighbouring Irish powers. A marcher lineage may use the language of royal service in one setting and the language of kinship and local lordship in another. These are not contradictions to be smoothed away. They are the very texture of medieval Irish life. That is why the future of the field has always depended on synthesis. Not a vague synthesis, but a hard-won one built on source criticism, linguistic skill, regional knowledge, and patience. English records need to be read not as neutral mirrors of reality, but as documents shaped by the priorities of government. Irish annals and bardic texts need to be used not as romantic alternatives, but as equally constructed and purposeful accounts of power, memory, and legitimacy. Archaeology, local landscape studies, church history, legal history, and literary evidence all have to speak to one another. Only then does the island begin to reappear as a connected, if fractured, whole. In that sense, the study of medieval Ireland has moved away from the old idea of two nations, with two completely separate histories. The most interesting work now shows contact, overlap, borrowing, negotiation, and mutual influence. It does not deny conflict. Conflict was constant and often brutal, but it also recognises that conflict itself created relationships. War led to alliances. Lordship led to bargaining. Law led to petitions for inclusion. Exclusion produced strategies of accommodation. Political necessity often brought together people whom ideology tried to keep apart. The boundaries mattered, but so did the crossings. So, the legacy of Richardson and Sales should be understood in the right spirit. They were not the authors of a finished interpretation. They were the builders of an essential foundation. Their priorities reflected the needs of their time, the sources they knew best, and the scholarly world in which they worked. If their influence contributed to a sharper distinction between English and Gaelic histories, it also gave later historians the tools needed to move beyond that distinction. Their work should not be treated as a narrow dead end, but as the first major stage in a much larger effort to understand medieval Ireland in all its complexity. What remains most important is not to choose between the Ireland of chancery rolls and the Ireland of Gaelic poetry, between the world of Parliament and the world of lordship, between institutional history and cultural history. The real task is to bring them together. Medieval Ireland was not one thing, and it was never stable. It was a land of overlapping sovereignties, layered identities, local ambitions, remembered ancestries, legal barriers, practical compromises, and constant negotiation. Any history that captures only one of those dimensions will be incomplete. The challenge is to hold them all in view at once. Edward III's decisions in Ireland were shaped by several pressures at once. One of them was the continuing unrest among the Gaelic Irish, especially in Leinster, where disorder had become a serious and lasting problem. There were already signs that the English administration understood that the old methods were not enough, and that some kind of accommodation with the Gaelic population might be necessary if the lordship was to survive. But the most urgent reason for action was political. Roger Mortimer had built enormous influence in Ireland, and his reach extended deep into the aristocratic world of the colony. He had rewarded powerful men on a grand scale, helping James Butler become Earl of Ormond and Maurice Fitz-Thomas become Earl of Desmond, while also giving them broad powers in their own territories. Even so, these generous grants had not brought stability. Rivalries among the leading families of Southern Ireland remained intense and often violent, especially after the breakdown of Edward II's rule. In the final phase of his life, Mortimer had also strengthened his own position by expanding his Irish lands and privileges in striking fashion. He gained important rights across Meath, and after the murder of the Earl of Louth, he also secured permanent custody of Athlone Castle. By the time Mortimer fell, the English crown had every reason to see Ireland not simply as a troubled dependency, but as one of the foundations of his personal power. Another influence on the king's thinking was his close connection with William de Burgh, the young Earl of Ulster. William stood close to the royal family by blood and marriage, and after Edward's seizure of power in 1330, he enjoyed support from the new regime. In the summer before Mortimer's downfall, the Deputy Justiciar Roger Outlaw had led a campaign into Munster, largely to confront Brian Ban O'Brien. Brian belonged to a branch of the O'Brien dynasty that had long been entangled in the politics of Thomond and in the ambitions of Anglo-Irish magnates. Shut out from the main O'Brien heartlands, he tried to build strength on the edges of Thomond and posed a real threat to Bunratty, to Limerick, and to important lordships in nearby regions. The Earl of Ulster joined that campaign, and the Irish host was summoned to Athassel, a place heavy with dynastic meaning for the de Burgh family. But the expedition collapsed into argument and mistrust. Ulster and Desmond fell into conflict, partly because Desmond kept dealing with Brian, and partly because Walter de Burgh of Connaught attacked Desmond's lands. Both earls were briefly placed in custody. Desmond escaped and drifted further from the authorities. Ulster, however, was released and crossed to England, where the new government firmly backed him. He was appointed the King's Lieutenant in Ireland, a title rarely used and reserved for moments of major crisis, giving him added authority in matters of peace and war. At this same moment, the appointment of Anthony Lucy as Justiciar of Ireland was a bold and unusual move. Most governors sent to Ireland from England had either possessed estates in Ireland themselves, or belonged to the king's military household. Lucy was different. He had no Irish landed base and no natural place among the colonial aristocracy. His value lay elsewhere. He had already proved himself on another frontier in northern England, where war with Scotland had demanded both military skill and hard administrative discipline. He was trusted, experienced, and politically reliable. The men who accompanied him to Ireland reveal even more about why he was chosen. Lucy didn't arrive merely with a few officials or household servants. He came with a remarkable cluster of Cumbrian gentry, men shaped by years of service on the Scottish border. Some were linked to him by land, some by office, some simply by long habits of cooperation. But together they formed a frontier group, transplanted from one troubled edge of the king's dominions to another. Their presence shows that the crown was deliberately transferring experienced personnel from the northern march to Ireland. This was not routine administration. It was a strategic redeployment. That northern connection reached into the highest offices in Dublin. Some appointments reflected broader administrative experience, but several of the most important places were filled by men closely tied to Lucy and to the world of the Northwest. Thomas de Burgh, who became Treasurer of Ireland, had Cumbrian associations and had long been active in royal administration in northern England. He sailed to Ireland with Lucy and remained there after Lucy's departure, even serving several times as Deputy Justiciar. Other senior judicial offices also went to men from the same northern environment. Sir Peter Tiliol and John Skelton, both linked to local government and military life in Cumberland and Westmoreland, were placed on the Justiciar's bench. Their appointment was striking. Ireland's courts were not yet reserved only for trained lawyers, but the concentration of so many northern English figures around Lucy was still extraordinary. The Crown had, in effect, shifted a governing network from the Scottish frontier into Ireland, as if it believed the same kind of frontier discipline might restore order there. Once in office, Lucy devoted most of his energy to suppressing unrest among the Anglo-Irish magnates. His methods were forceful, even by the standards of a hard age, and they may at times have deepened the tensions they were meant to control. One of the first major policies he enforced was the revocation of grants made during the years when Mortimer had dominated government. Later, historians sometimes portrayed this as oppressive, but in reality it was simply the Irish extension of measures already taken in England after Edward III overthrew Mortimer. The new king was undoing what he saw as an abuse of royal authority. In Ireland, this meant cancelling pensions, restoring revenues to the crown and seizing Mortimer's lands, goods, and records. Sheriffs were told that indulgent financial arrangements granted in earlier years were no longer valid. The administration moved rapidly and aggressively. There were even signs that local officials overreached, stripping away grants that should have remained in force and showing reluctance when English instructions protected the rights of Mortimer's widow. The pattern is clear. Lucy arrived not only to govern, but to help dismantle the political legacy of the Mortimer years. For Lucy himself, the first great priority was the south, where he believed aristocratic disorder had reached a dangerous level. This meant that confrontation with Desmond was almost inevitable. During the late summer of 1331, Lucy moved through South Leinster and Munster with a substantial force, accompanied by leading officials and by the Earl of Ulster. The immediate pretext was Desmond's refusal to attend Parliament. He had already avoided an earlier assembly and was plainly in poor standing with the government. At first, there was an appearance of compromise. Contact was made, Desmond submitted, and conditional pardons were issued. Then Lucy abruptly changed direction. In mid-August, he arrested Desmond in Limerick, and by early October the Earl had been brought back to Dublin Castle as a prisoner. His lands and lordships were treated as forfeit. By the standards normally used by the English crown in dealing with powerful Irish magnates, this was an astonishingly severe step. To justify these actions, the government gathered evidence from juries in major towns such as Limerick, Cork, and Waterford. Their testimony painted Desmond as a dangerous disturber of the peace over many years. He was accused of plotting against the justiciar, threatening the citizens of Limerick, maintaining links with Brian Ban O'Brien and other violent figures, and encouraging crimes carried out by his followers. In these accounts, Desmond appears less as a straightforward rebel than as a man whose influence made unrest spread outward through networks of clients, allies, and opportunists. Some of the accusations were probably exaggerated. Much of the violence associated with men like Brian was not fully under Desmond's control. Yet Lucy clearly believed that Desmond's power, independence, and shifting loyalties made him too dangerous to leave untouched. At the same time, pressure was also being applied in other directions. In Cork, a jury challenged Desmond's claim to overlordship over territories that had become the subject of a wider legal and political struggle. This was not just a local quarrel. It grew from arguments about inheritance, royal rights, and whether grants had been made lawfully in the first place. The important point is that Lucy's campaign against Desmond did not stand alone. It formed part of a broader effort by the new regime to reopen disputed settlements, weaken magnates whose power had grown under Mortimer, and reassert direct royal authority in places where that authority had become blurred. Desmond's arrest was quickly followed by others, especially in circles connected to the Earl of Ulster. In September, Henry Mandeville was seized and sent to Dublin Castle. Not long afterward, Ulster moved against his own Connaught kinsman, arresting Walter de Burgh and his brothers. Walter later died in custody. These actions reveal another side of the crisis. The great lordships of Ireland had long been managed through delegation and negotiated power sharing, especially in a vast inheritance like that of the de Burghs. The older generation had understood that such territories could not be ruled by direct command alone. But the young Earl of Ulster took a harsher line, and that sharpened tensions rather than calming them. Lucy's arrival, therefore, coincided with a moment when the English government and one of its greatest Irish allies were both moving toward a more confrontational style. During the following months, Lucy remained active in Meath, Uriel, and then once again in Munster. It was in this later phase that the most dramatic accusations against Desmond began to circulate. Juries claimed that years earlier, leading magnates had plotted to rebel, crown Desmond as king in Ireland and divide the country among themselves. Another jury described a supposed plan in which Desmond, William Birmingham, Walter de Burgh, Brian Ban O'Brien and others would partition the provinces and make Desmond their ruler. These stories are difficult to believe in any literal sense. They seem too theatrical, too neatly shaped and too politically useful. Maurice Fitz-Thomas was not even the most senior among the great lords, so the idea that others would naturally accept him as king is hard to credit. Yet these charges should not simply be dismissed as nonsense. They probably reflected real currents of political language and ambition, especially in a world where Gaelic ideas of kingship, bardic praise, and aristocratic self-fashioning could mingle with Anglo-Irish politics. Desmond may never have been planning an actual coronation, but it is very likely that stories of royal destiny and lordship were being circulated among his allies and clients in ways that alarm the government. This matters because Desmond, like some other frontier magnates in the wider Plantagenet world, operated in more than one cultural sphere. He could present himself differently, depending on the audience before him. Among English officials, he was an Earl of the colony. Among Irish allies, he could appear as a war leader of far larger promise. The language of kingship may have been less a practical program than a way of magnifying status, attracting support, and giving symbolic form to local ambitions. The accusations against him reveal how deeply English authorities feared that a magnate who crossed cultural boundaries too effectively might turn into something more dangerous than a rebellious noble. He might become the centre of a wider political alternative. Yet for all the drama of the accusations, the government did not fully act on them. Neither Desmond nor William Birmingham was formally tried for these supposed kingly conspiracies. When Birmingham was eventually executed, it was for felony connected with an attempted escape from Dublin Castle, not for treason in a grand political sense. Even then, his death lacked the full ritual humiliations usually inflicted on traitors. This hesitation is revealing. Lucy and his advisors may have suspected that the evidence gathered from southern juries would not survive close examination. Or perhaps they understood that such severe action required clearer direction from the king himself. Either way, the gap between accusation and formal prosecution suggests caution behind the violence. While these struggles among magnates dominated high politics, another crisis was worsening in Leinster. There, Gaelic raids had long troubled the frontier zones, especially across the lands lying south and west of Dublin. For decades, this violence had remained limited, because rival Irish lineages often checked one another, and because local defence, short military expeditions, and tactical diplomacy could usually prevent disaster. But during the 1320s, conditions changed. Bad harvests and disease among cattle weakened the countryside. Seigneurial control retreated in upland zones. At the same time, the political collapse of Edward II's regime and the feuds among Anglo-Irish lords created openings for more ambitious Irish leaders. In 1328, Domnall, son of Art MacMurrough, gathered enough support to present himself as King of Leinster. His claims were quickly curtailed, but the region remained unstable. O'Byrnes, MacMurroughs, O'Nolans and O'Moores continued to compete, raid and negotiate in shifting combinations. English officials mounted expeditions and at times, even Desmond himself campaigned in South Leinster against Irish enemies. But these efforts brought only temporary relief. In 1331, the situation worsened sharply. Arklow Castle fell. Ferns was seized. Raids struck places close to Dublin itself. Negotiation was attempted, even through churchmen sent into the uplands to deal with powerful Irish leaders. But the results were limited. Hostages were taken from some leading figures, and 1 or 2 Irish rulers were restored to payment from the crown in return for service. yet the broader condition remained fragile. Only in 1332, once Lucy had partly stabilised, the politics of the magnates, was a major military response possible. The Leinster campaign of that year was carefully planned and unusually ambitious by the standards of the Dublin government. Lucy focused on two castles, Arklow on the coast and Clonmore farther inland. These were not chosen at random. They stood in a zone where the worlds of the O'Byrnes and the Mac Murrows overlapped, and where control of fortifications could disrupt the emergence of broader coalitions. During June, Lucy led a large army into the uplands on the borders of Wicklow, Carlow and Wexford. At the same time, defensive positions were organised behind the main front, especially at Tallaght and Ballymore Eustace, where troops were maintained to guard the approaches between mountain and plain. The campaign was supported by taxation, careful exemptions and serious logistical planning. By Irish standards, it represented a substantial mobilisation of resources. The attack on Clonmore drew together a paid force much larger than usual. More than 1,500 men were involved at its height, including a strikingly large contingent under Loisiach O'More. This is especially important because it shows the government working not only against Irish leaders, but also with selected Irish allies. Lucy was willing to build direct relationships where it served the Crown's interests, particularly now that Mortimer's lands had fallen to the king and old patterns of lordship were disrupted. There was real fighting in the campaign, and rewards were even paid for the severed heads of enemies. The brutality is unmistakable, but so too is the strategic intelligence behind Lucy's choices. Clonmore occupied a key route between inland valleys and the coast. Arklow, once recovered, had the great advantage of sea supply. Together, these strong points could anchor English power in a region that had become dangerously exposed. Lucy's building and repair work at Clonmore was one of the clearest signs that the Crown still believed in rebuilding military infrastructure in Ireland, even at a time when older historians once imagined castle construction had almost ceased. The government retained Clonmore directly for years afterward and paid its constable a very large salary, showing how seriously it valued the site. Arklow too remained under close official control for much of the following period. Lucy's efforts did not transform Leinster into a secure region overnight. Raiding did not vanish, and smaller campaigns continued in later years. But his actions did mark the beginning of more purposeful and better organised government intervention. Other governors later followed this example, repairing additional castles and maintaining strategic posts. For a time at least, the Crown had regained a degree of initiative. Lucy's governorship ended in late 1332, when he was recalled to England. Before leaving, he spent his final weeks campaigning once more toward Thomond after Irish forces retook Bunratty. Some observers in Dublin later wrote of him as if he had been removed in disgrace, and certainly his methods had enemies. His arrest of great lords, his severity, and above all his execution of William Birmingham shocked many, yet it would be wrong to see his departure as a simple dismissal for failure. Throughout his rule, his actions had been watched closely by the king and council. He had not acted in isolation. If, at times, England seemed to soften course, summoning Irish advisers for consultation and instructing that some rebels be received back into peace. This reflected not a rejection of Lucy's methods, but a shift in timing. Edward III was preparing for the possibility of his own arrival in Ireland. Lucy had imposed discipline. The king hoped to appear afterward in an atmosphere shaped by both fear and reconciliation. The return of Anthony Lucy and his hardened northern companions to England was not accidental. It was driven by a much larger decision made by Edward III. The king had chosen to reopen the war in Scotland, backing Edward Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne. That decision changed everything. Ireland, which had just seen a surge of strong government under Lucy, suddenly became secondary again. The demands of war in Scotland pulled experienced commanders and soldiers away, and at the same time forced the king to rethink how he dealt with powerful Irish lords. One of the clearest signs of this shift was the release of the Earl of Desmond in 1333. Only a short time earlier, he had been one of the most dangerous figures in Ireland, imprisoned and stripped of power. But now, with Scotland calling for troops, he became useful again. The same was true for Walter Birmingham, who had also fallen into trouble but was gradually brought back into favour. When an Irish force sailed to Scotland in 1335, both men contributed large numbers of soldiers. It was a striking reversal. Men who had once been treated as threats were now essential allies in the king's wider wars. Meanwhile, Lucy's own career did not slow down. In fact, it expanded dramatically. Back in northern England, he returned to the role he understood best: frontier warfare. He served again as Sheriff of Cumberland, became a key figure in the defence of the border, and led raids into Scotland. In one campaign, he even fought alongside the king's brother. Soon after, he was involved in the relief of Edinburgh, working directly with Edward Balliol himself. For a time, Lucy stood at the centre of English power in the north. His responsibilities grew even further. He was appointed Constable of Berwick and given authority over large parts of southern Scotland that had been handed to Edward III. This meant overseeing major castles and maintaining control in a region that was constantly under threat. At one point, he was even described as the king's lieutenant, responsible for organising troops not just in Scotland, but across northern England as well. Few men in the kingdom carried such weight. For a brief moment, as English fortunes rose, Lucy was one of the king's most trusted and powerful servants. But like many careers in this period, his success was tied to the unstable tides of war. The lands and rewards he received in Scotland looked impressive on paper, but they depended entirely on continued English dominance. As the war shifted, those gains faded. Even so, his position remained strong enough that he later took part in overseeing petitions from across the king's dominions, including Ireland. By this stage, his influence was not only military but administrative and political, and even his son had begun to share in that status. When we step back and compare the two worlds Lucy moved between, the similarities are striking. Northern England and Ireland were both frontier regions, both exposed to conflict, and both deeply affected by the weaknesses of central government. Problems that began in the king's court could quickly spread outward, turning local tensions into open disorder. In both regions, powerful lords held great authority, sometimes too much, and could act in ways that stretched or even ignored royal control. In the north, the threat came from Scotland. Raids, invasions, and shifting loyalties were constant dangers. In Ireland, the situation was even more complex. There, conflict did not follow a single clear line. Instead, it spread across a patchwork of territories, where Anglo-Irish lords, Gaelic rulers, and local communities all competed for power. Alliances changed quickly, and violence could erupt almost anywhere. Yet there were also important differences. In northern England, the border with Scotland, though dangerous, was clearly defined. There was a recognised frontier, and both sides understood where it lay. In Ireland, no such clarity existed. The boundaries between English-controlled lands and Gaelic territories were fluid and constantly shifting. Power depended not just on military strength, but on negotiation, alliances, and local influence. Another difference lay in identity. In the north, people generally saw themselves as English or Scottish. Even in a war zone, the structure of society remained relatively stable. In Ireland, identity was more complicated. Anglo-Irish lords often operated in both English and Gaelic worlds, adapting to different cultural and political environments. This made the system more flexible, but also more fragile. These differences shaped how the crown governed each region. In northern England, the king could rely on a network of loyal nobles and officials. Rivalries existed, but they could often be controlled. In Ireland, the situation was more delicate. The great families were deeply rooted in their regions, and removing one could destabilise the entire structure of power. This is why harsh actions, like those taken against Desmond, were often followed by reconciliation. The crown could not afford to destroy the very system it depended on. The problems of control can be seen even in practical matters, like finance. When a powerful lord like Desmond was removed, his lands did not automatically produce revenue for the crown. Instead, local custodians took over, and income often disappeared. Officials struggled to collect what was owed, and investigations dragged on without clear results. In some cases, the crown only began to see money again, when the same lord was restored to power. It was a system that depended heavily on cooperation, not just authority. Even the use of punishment reflected these differences. In England, noble rebellion could lead to brutal executions, designed to serve as public warnings. In Ireland, such extreme measures were rarely applied to major lords. Lesser figures might suffer harsh penalties, but the great magnates were usually treated with more caution. The crown understood that pushing too far could lead to wider collapse. At the same time, both regions shared a common feeling of neglect. In the north, there were complaints that the king focused more on internal politics than on defending the border. In Ireland, similar frustrations appeared in appeals for help and support. Communities on the edges of the realm often felt that they were left to defend themselves, even as they remained loyal to the crown. Still, northern England had one major advantage. It remained fully integrated into the kingdom. Its counties were represented in Parliament, its laws were consistently applied, and its leaders worked within a familiar system. Ireland, by contrast, existed in a more uncertain position. Its political identity developed separately, shaped by its own institutions and its unique mix of cultures. By the mid-14th century, these differences were becoming more pronounced. In northern England, a distinct frontier society was beginning to form, but it was still closely tied to the rest of the kingdom. In Ireland, the situation was more fragmented. Power was divided among regional lords, many of whom relied on Gaelic allies and operated within local networks of loyalty. This complexity made Ireland far harder to govern. It was not enough to win battles or punish rebels. The crown had to navigate a web of relationships, balancing authority with negotiation. Strong governors like Lucy and later Ufford could impose order for a time, but maintaining that order required constant effort. If Ralph Ufford had been a king ruling England directly, his approach might have been praised as nearly perfect. He acted decisively, took firm control of administration, crushed a rebellious lord without hesitation, and skillfully used royal rewards to build a loyal following. In many ways, he did exactly what a strong ruler was expected to do. But Ireland was not England, and power there worked very differently. What Ufford achieved was impressive, but it was also fragile. His authority depended heavily on his personal presence, his energy, and his army. Once he was gone, much of what he built began to weaken almost immediately. This was one of the core problems of governing Ireland in the 14th century. The king himself was far away, and the country was ruled by deputies who rarely stayed in office for long. Just when one governor began to understand the situation and impose order, he was replaced, and the entire process had to start again. At the same time, Ireland was not a place that could be controlled from a single centre. It was too large, too divided, and too constantly under threat. Every region required its own defence, its own leadership, and its own balance of power. This made strong local lords not just a problem, but a necessity. The crown needed them, even when they acted against royal authority. Without them, entire regions could fall into chaos. This left the king with a difficult choice after Ufford's death. Instead of a stable foundation, he inherited a series of urgent problems. Disorder returned quickly, showing how temporary Ufford's achievements had been. A new governor could try to continue his policies, but in reality, he would have to adapt, build new alliances, and often take a completely different approach. Some of Ufford's methods were continued, such as holding courts in troubled areas and appointing royal officials to maintain order. But these measures alone were not enough. Before long, attention turned once again to the Earl of Desmond. Despite everything that had happened, the government faced a familiar dilemma. They could not effectively control his lands without him, and they could not easily replace his authority. His territories risked slipping into the same kind of instability that had already affected other major regions. In the end, the decision was made to restore him. Like Kildare, he returned to favour and even served the government in his later years. This cycle of rebellion, punishment, and reconciliation would repeat itself again and again in Irish history. This reveals something fundamental about politics in medieval Ireland. Governing the country was not simply a matter of enforcing law and punishing disorder. It required managing powerful men like Desmond, whose authority came not just from royal grants, but from their own networks of loyalty and influence. They commanded both Anglo-Irish settlers and Gaelic followers, and they operated in a world where survival often depended on flexibility rather than strict obedience to the crown. Desmond himself was not simply a rebel for the sake of rebellion. He lived in a harsh and unstable environment, where he was expected to protect his lands, his followers, and his allies. That often meant making decisions that royal officials would see as disloyal or even treasonous. But from his perspective, they were necessary. Even officials in Dublin understood this at times. They knew that Ireland was in a constant state of conflict, and that even loyal lords were forced to bend or break the law to survive. If they were punished too harshly, they might have no choice but to turn fully against the crown. By the summer of 1345, conflict between Ufford and Desmond had become unavoidable. Desmond had pushed too far, and Ufford could not ignore him. But it is also clear that Ufford's own actions helped escalate the situation. Desmond had avoided open rebellion before, even under pressure. Yet when his authority was challenged directly and his interests threatened, he chose to fight. Once war began, Ufford's strengths became clear. He acted quickly, gathered a powerful army, and crushed opposition with determination. His victory was decisive, but it came at a cost. The deeper issue was not military, but political. Governing through deputies created a constant tension. These officials were expected to defend royal authority, but they did not always have the freedom or the confidence to make the compromises that were often necessary. They could enforce the law, but they could not always offer the flexibility needed to maintain stability. In a place like Ireland, where power depended on relationships as much as rules, that limitation could be dangerous. Looking back, it becomes clear that Ufford possessed many of the qualities needed for strong leadership. He was energetic, determined, and capable of imposing order in difficult circumstances. But he lacked something equally important, the ability to navigate the delicate balance of Irish politics. His decisions, while logical from a royal perspective, sometimes ignored the realities on the ground. In Ireland, authority could not simply be enforced. It had to be negotiated, maintained, and constantly adjusted.